Welcome to Jackie's Craft Table. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I've spent all weekend playing with Simon Says Stamps' June card kit. It's called Fly Me Away, and it's just a fabulous kit. I'm going to show you what it includes. There are so many fun products included in this kit. I really had a ball playing with all of them. Here's the little lollipop that they always include. Everything's better with a treat, right? This is the Distress Resist Spray, and I was a little intimidated with this, but once I forced myself to play with it, I really had fun with it. This embossing folder I was very excited about. This is one of the new 3D embossing folders from Tim Holtz, and I really like this one because it includes leaves and flowers on it. It's really a heavy-duty folder. It's not like your usual embossing folders. I don't think I've used an embossing folder for quite a while, so it's going to be fun to play with. This is the Daniel Smith watercolor paint dots. I've never used Daniel Smith watercolors before, so I'm excited for that. They included a watercolor card to paint in. I thought that was really cute. I love the sentiment on this. I love the Simon Says stamp envelopes that they include. I use them up pretty fast. These are both very shimmery and nice. The pattern paper that they included is just gorgeous. I loved every single sheet of this. They're single-sided, and they have a good weight to them, so I really liked that. I'm going to show you each of the papers. And I love the watercolor florals and the stripes. There's a lot of hot air balloons included. And I love the color scheme of this. It's just beautiful. I have a few sheets left over from these cards that I created using these papers, so I have more to make. Those two look really good together, I thought. I love that one because you could make a good masculine card out of it. That one too. The feathers are just gorgeous. This is the piece I'm going to use first. But this is actually my favorite of all of them. I love all of the little buildings and the balloons and the color scheme. It's just so pretty. Now, this stamp set is one of the things that I was most excited about for this kit. It's called Beautiful Flowers, and it comes with so many wonderful sentiments as well as these gorgeous flowers. I recently purchased a larger stamp positioner because I just have the Mini Misty, and I was thinking of this stamp set when I purchased it. With a larger platform, you just have more room to position your stamps. They included this sheet of beautiful card examples that you can use for inspiration. And then here are the card stocks. And the first one is called Peacock. And then they included a piece of their white cardstock, and that's really a heavy-duty white cardstock. I really like it. This one's called Cornflower Blue. The gray is called Smoke, and here is the piece of golden cardstock. This white cardstock was so thick, I thought maybe it was 2 sheets. So that's why I'm just double checking that. And that's everything included in this lovely kit. There were so many fun things in this kit, I had a hard time deciding where to begin. As I said earlier, I am going to use that piece of pattern paper I showed you. It's so pretty, and I loved the color scheme of it. I'm going to stamp out this large stamp on that. I love stamping on pattern paper and then using my Prismacolor pencil because it gives you kind of a base color to start with. Here's where this large Tim Holtz stamping platform comes in handy. I'm inking up this stamp set with my favorite black ink. It's called Extreme Black Ink from My Favorite Things. And one thing I wished I had done was I wished I had marked out better where I had placed this piece of pattern paper, because after you color with Prismacolor pencils, it can kind of dull the lines, and it's good to re-stamp it after you're done with your coloring. But it worked out okay. I tried to be careful to color within the lines and not go over the black lines too much. I stamped this up a few times because I like it good and dark. I understand that this kit is sold out, but you can buy the stamp set separately. I pulled out a few Prismacolor pencils that matched well with this colored paper, and I'm going to speed color here for you because I'm not doing anything groundbreaking. I'm just putting down some shadows and some highlights and having fun coloring in this gorgeous stamp. I allowed the color of the pattern paper to show through a little bit as well. This video is called 10 Cards 1 Kit, but I actually end up making 12 cards that I'm going to show you today. I thought when I had stamped this that it would look gorgeous without the coloring even. So if you don't fancy coloring, I would just leave it and let the pattern paper show through completely, and it'll be very beautiful. Next for my sentiments, and I'm going to stamp the happy birthday from all of us. I love that little phrase from all of us because I can use cards like that a lot. And I'm going to stamp it down onto a piece of acetate first just to make sure the placement looks right. Sometimes it's hard for me to tell if I get it straight or not. It looks good to me. I can just wash this acetate off or scrub it off with a little tissue and reuse it. I just keep it at the side of my desk. Now I'm going to stamp it right onto the piece of pattern paper. And again, I do stamp things more than once just to get it nice and crisp. My mom's birthday is coming up soon, and so I think I'm going to be sending this one out in the mail to her. I think she would really love that. So Mom, if you're watching, this one's for you. I want to mat this with a piece of black cardstock, so I'm going to cut down this panel to 5 1/4 by 4. I'm just cutting 1/8 of an inch off of each side to accomplish that. And now I can adhere everything together. I'm going to use my dot liner for this. And I can just put that right down onto the card base. And for my next panel, some more dot liner. And I'm going to center that onto the black piece of paper. I'm going to decorate the inside of this card. I'm going to use the sentiment that says, "You are loved." I really like all of the fonts that they used on these sentiments. I like that you can color some of them in. I'm using scrap paper from the pieces that I cut down to put some stripes on the bottom of this card. And I can just cut off the excess. I wanted to add a little more sparkle to the front of this card, so I pulled out my assorted moonshine sequins. I'm just going to place a few along the perimeter of the flowers. I'm using my Gina K Connect glue to adhere these. And that completes my first card. On card number 2, I'm using my very favorite piece of pattern paper. I think I could use more of this. It's so pretty. So I'm cutting this down to 3 3/4 by 5. I'm going to mat it again with a piece of black cardstock. This is a very simple and fast card. I'm stamping the sentiment, "Wishing you joy," right between those balloons. And I'm going to use a bit of baker's twine. This is white and pink, and I thought the pink matched well with my cardstock. I'm tying a little bow right over that hot air balloon. I haven't used baker's twine in a while. I just forget that I have it in my stash, but I really like the effect it has. Once I tie my bow, I am going to pull out a micro dot to put under that bow, just so I can be sure that it's going to stay in place. I'm just using my craft knife to scrape that off the release paper and slide that under the knot. I'm also using a piece of the smoke cardstock as my card base. I'm adhering all of my cardstocks together with more dot liner. I'm going to just put this in the upper right corner. Gives it a different kind of look. I'm going to color in the sentiment, "Joy," with a couple of Prismacolor pencils. And I'll have all of the pencils and everything I use listed over on my blog. I really have fun decorating the insides of my cards, and I couldn't resist but to use another scrap of this pretty pattern paper. I'm just going to put a stripe of that down the side. I save all of my scraps of cardstock for just this purpose. It's fun to have a little surprise when you open the card as well. Once I have that in place, I'm just going to flip the card over and cut off the overhang. I don't have many Nouveau drops in my collection, but I happen to have this pretty silver one. I'm just going to add a few dots of that next to my joy. I'm slapping that down onto my ink just to make the dots flatten out a little bit. Card number 3 is another quick and easy card. I cut down this piece of pattern paper to 5 1/4 by 4, and I'm going to add a little bit of silver embossing powder around the edges. So I'm just using my Versamark ink pad to kind of slide that across the edges. That gives it a pretty gilded, is gilded only for gold, but a pretty gilded look along the edge. And I do this a couple of times. I really love purple and silver. I think they really go well together. And I want this edging to be kind of rough. I don't want it to be perfect. And I'm going to emboss this scrap piece from the pattern paper as well for the inside of the card. I never get tired of embossing with these beautiful embossing powders they have out on the market. For the sentiment on this card, I'm going to do some more embossing. I'm using my black cardstock and white embossing powder. I'm going to cut these sentiments into little strips of paper. I love this set because you can kind of build what you want to say, build your own sentiment. And this one's going to say, sending lots of love and hugs your way. This purple hot air balloon just makes the perfect centerpiece for one of your cards. The cardstock I'm using is from my own stash. It's called Green-Eyed Monster, and it's from My Favorite Things. I just love this cardstock. I thought it matched the greenery in the flower bouquet pretty well. I'm attaching my second piece of pattern paper that I embossed to the inside of the card and just cutting off the overhang again. I think that looks really pretty on the inside. I also added some clear and purple sequins to add even more sparkle. Next up are cards 4 and 5. I got 2 cards out of this process. This is a technique I learned from Jennifer McGuire, and you need to use a large stamp for this technique, so I thought this stamp would just be perfect. I'm inking that up with some Versamark ink, and I'm going to emboss it with clear embossing powder. This is just going to be a very subtle look on this side of the card. You'll see what I'm doing here in just a minute. Now I can melt this embossing powder. It's just a very pretty tone-on-tone look. This is a piece of the cornflower blue cardstock I'm using. I'm going to stamp this again on a piece of white cardstock in the exact same position. I stamped this with my extreme black ink because it is Copic friendly. I sped up my coloring super fast for the sake of time. It's just kind of fun to see it being colored in really fast like this. I chose colors that coordinated really well with my cornflower blue cardstock. Since blue and orange are complementary colors, I'm coloring 2 of these flowers orange. And then I couldn't resist but to include a blue flower. And I tried to match the cornflower blue pretty well. This stamp is pretty easy to color in. The artist who drew this included a lot of lines that indicate shading, so you know right where to put your shadows. Here are my 2 panels completed. Now this is the scary part. I'm going to pull out my Fiskars paper trimmer and cut these in half. So I'll have half of my cards with the tone-on-tone embossing and the other half with my Copic coloring. This is how they're going to look. I think it's so pretty. I'm using a piece of the gold cardstock that came in this kit to stamp my sentiment onto. And I'm also using Stays On ink. I tried using my extreme black ink first, and maybe I didn't give it enough time to dry, but it smudged. But this Stays On ink worked perfectly. I'm going to stamp that out twice, so I just flipped the paper so I could easily stamp it again. Then I can cut these into strips. I'm adhering these panel pieces right onto my card base. It's made from Nina Solar White cardstock and is the 120-pound version. You'll see at the top right of the screen that I cut off a piece from the card panels as well to make room for the sentiment strip. If I didn't do that, the flowers would have looked too elongated. But I'm not going to waste those pretty strips of paper. I'm going to use them on the insides of my cards. I'm trimming off the overhang again here, and there was a little sliver of white showing on the right side of this card, so I just pulled out my Fiskars paper trimmer again just to clean that up. I'm using more dot liner to attach these pretty strips of paper. I eventually run out of my dot liner, so I start using glue for everything later on. I pulled out some clear gems. I'm going to add them to the tops of these cards, just along the border of my flowers. And these two cards are complete. I just love how they turned out. This was a really fun technique to try. I saw a lot of card examples using these feathers already, and I wanted to use them too. They're just too gorgeous not to use on a card, but I wanted to do something a little different. So I'm stamping a bunch of sentiments along the feathers. So this card is going to say, "Thanks so much, you are so loved." It's very subtle, but I liked how it turned out. It's just fun. I'm going to use another strip of the cornflower blue cardstock to stamp my sentiment "loved" onto. I pulled out two Prismacolor pencils to color in this sentiment. I'm using white and lilac. Again, I'm being careful to color inside of the lines because sometimes the colored pencils can obscure them. I'm adding more purple and clear sequins to the front of this card. I'm using another Nina Solar White 110-pound cardstock for my card base. And then to decorate the inside, I'm using more scrap papers. I'm gluing these down on a diagonal. How's that for a quick and easy card? I really love how this turned out. Now it's time to play with the Daniel Smith watercolor dots that they included in the kit. This card base is made of Canson XL watercolor paper. This will be a single layer card. I'm inking up this stamp with some VersaFine Onyx black ink. This ink stays wet a little bit longer so that you can easily emboss over it. I'm just going to add some clear embossing powder over that. When you emboss your stamped images, it makes the watercoloring go a lot faster. It keeps your watercolors in place and prevents bleeding. I just stamped out a piece of this large stamp, and I just think it looks so pretty on the front of the card. I'm pouring over some Gina K Designs clear embossing powder and flicking off the excess. And then I'm being very careful to move my heat tool around because I'm trying to prevent the paper from warping. It does end up warping a little bit, but not too bad. For my middle flower, I mixed up a pretty coral color, and I'm just going to put down a base layer of color first. And then while the paint is still wet, I'm going to drop in some darker colors to add shadows. It was really fun playing with these Daniel Smith watercolors. They're very nice. I taped down my card panel with some purple tape. This will prevent it from warping from all the water. I also decided to emboss my sentiment with more clear embossing powder. And now for another fun part. I'm putting this in a cardboard box. I'm going to do some paint flicking. I wanted to protect the sentiment from all of these flicks of color, so I just covered that up. I'm using the same colors that I used to paint in my flowers, just to add little dots of color over this panel. I love this paint flicking technique. It just adds a lot of interest to the card. I wanted to add some sparkle to the flowers, so I'm using my Wink of Stella brush just to go over the flowers a little bit and add some glitter. On the inside of the card, I used one of the single flower stamps and I inked that up with gray ink just to make it more subtle and so it wouldn't obscure the sentiment "Love and Hugs." We are on to card number 8 already, and I'm going to pull out this embossing folder for this card. Isn't that gorgeous? Just leaving it plain white would work. I embossed about 3/4 of this panel because I wanted a flat space where I could stamp out my sentiment. I'm using the sentiment that says, "You are a treasure to me." I'm stamping that out with some more extreme black ink a couple of times again. And then I pulled out my gold Delicata ink. I'm gently sponging over the raised images of this panel. This golden ink is kind of shimmery too, so it has a really nice effect once I apply enough ink. And then, of course, I have to use some of the gold paper included in this kit. And I'm putting a strip of it in between the sentiment and the embossing. I think that's a nice touch. I'm going to round these corners with my corner chomper. This really softens the look of your card. I'm also going to use some of the gold paper as my card base. I'm rounding off all 4 corners of the card base as well. I'm using some more liquid adhesive to adhere this panel onto my card base. I'm going to cover this panel with my mini Misty just to hold that in place until it dries. I forgot to mention that they do suggest that you mist your cardstock before you use the embossing folder. Just because it is such a detailed embossing folder, the moisture helps mold it into all the crevices of the embossing folder. And they also suggest to run it through your die cutting machine 3 times. This next card is probably the most complicated one of all of them. This is a piece of Tim Holtz watercolor paper, and I'm using the smooth side to stamp my sentiment. I'm going to heat emboss this with some more clear embossing powder, and it's really hard to see on the camera. This is going to be a birthday card, so I'm using the word happy, and then I wanted to use the word birthday from this stamp. So I masked off the happy just so I could use the word birthday. I'm pouring over more clear embossing powder over this word. I'm going to use a piece of masking tape to cover up my sentiment. You'll see why I'm doing this a little bit later, but it does create a very cute effect. So now I need to pull out my cardboard box again. When using this Distress Resist spray, they suggest to use a cardboard box just to protect your work surface. I'm applying this pretty liberally, and then I give it a few minutes to dry. I pulled off my masking paper, and I'm going to start ink blending with some Salty Ocean and Seedless Preserves. When these 2 colors meet and blend together, it creates such a pretty deep purple color. And you can see all of the fabulous resist spray on this panel. I just love the effect of this stuff. Because I protected my sentiment with the masking paper, it created this cute banner over my sentiment. I'm cutting down this piece of pattern paper, and I like I don't know if they're hollyhocks or what these flowers are, but I want those to show at the side of my card. So I'm going to attach this to my card base. I decided to pull out my Tombow Extreme adhesive to attach this to my card base just because this is a thicker watercolor paper. I have quite a bit of overhang left on this card panel, but I'm going to put it to good use. You'll see here in a minute. I like to use long scissors to cut off the overhang. It just helps me cut a straighter line. So here's the extra piece that I cut off from the front of my card. and I'm just attaching that to the inside. I really love the look of these flowers. I'm also going to glue on a strip of paper that came off of my Distress Oxide panel. The Distress Oxide inks I chose really blended in well with this patterned paper. There are a lot of techniques that you can do with this Distress Resist spray. I'm definitely going to be playing with that again soon. Well, we're already up to card number 10. And for this card, I'm going to use a piece of the Peacock cardstock. I understand that this is a new color for Simon Says stamp, and I wanted to see what white embossing powder would look like on this card. I'm embossing the sentiment that says beautiful, as well as the 3 single flowers that came in the stamp set. I really love the look of white embossing powder on darker cardstocks. Once I've melted the sentiment and this flower, I'm going to stamp out the other 2 next to it. I have this pink flower that I had stamped out. I was going to use that for a card, but it didn't turn out, so I'm just using it as a mask. And it will also protect my white heat embossing on this flower because I don't want to melt that any more than I already have. So what I've been doing with the cardstocks that come in these kits is I cut them in half, usually the long way. So I have 2 card bases, and then I actually cut one of the card bases in half, and I use that for card panels, and the other piece I use for an actual card base. It just helps to keep my options open in case I want to use them for card bases, or I could use them for card panels. I cut down this Peacock card panel down to 5 1/4 by 4. I used 2 Prismacolor pencils to color in these flowers. I wanted to see how the Prismacolors would look on this dark cardstock as well. So far, I like it. And now I'm stamping on the sentiment that says, "You are so," right onto the pattern paper. I'm going to cut out this pattern paper into many different strips and just add them onto my card panel. I also cut up strips of a white piece of cardstock for these white strips of paper. I thought the white really helped the white embossing powder to pop. I'm using more Gina K Connect glue to adhere this panel onto my card base, and I'm finding that I like using the liquid adhesive because it gives you some wiggle room. So if you don't get your card base perfectly placed, you can wiggle it a little bit until it's just right. I'm pulling out my gray ink again to stamp the flowers on the inside of the card. I didn't mask my flowers for the inside, I just stamped them next to each other. And I think this is where I should have stopped. I pulled out some bubblegum blush, Nouveau Crystal drops, and I added dots around the flowers. And I don't like that effect very much, but there you have it. That one's done. I think it would have looked better without the drops. For card number 11, I cut down another piece of pattern paper. I cut it down to 5 by 3 3/4. And the rest of the pattern paper, I'm just cutting out some of the pretty flowers. I put a few square dots behind them and attached them to my other piece of cornflower blue cardstock. And this is just going to add a little bit of dimension. The blue paper behind it really helps to differentiate the flower from the pattern paper flowers. I'm going to do that with 2 of the different flowers from this pattern paper. I had already stamped the sentiment onto this piece of pattern paper, and I used a few of the sentiments. This one says, "Thanks, you are a treasure to me." Adding that with another cornflower blue piece of cardstock. I'm using a piece of the smoke cardstock for my card base. And then I'm using the same Nouveau Crystal drops for this card, and I like how this one turned out really well. I'm adding a few more of my bits of scrap paper for the inside of the card. I really love how this card turned out, soft and elegant. So here's a look at the front of it again, and there's the inside. And now for my very last card for this kit. that I'm filming. I'll probably go on to do more later. I'm going to make a masculine birthday card, and I'm using this piece of pattern paper with the blue hot air balloons on it. And I'm stamping the word happy out 3 times. And then this stamp set included a tiny little sentiment that says birthday, and so I stamped that underneath. I colored in the middle sentiment with a turquoise Prismacolor pencil. I'm using my very last piece of golden cardstock, and I'm adhering that to a peacock card base. To decorate the inside of my card, I'm cutting out some of the balloons from this piece of pattern paper, and I'm just going to glue them right in the corner, and as well as another piece of the golden cardstock. And I think this makes just the perfect masculine birthday card. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sorry the video was so long. I hope that these cards have inspired you to sit down and create something awesome. Have a wonderful day. Bye.